The polished mahogany table felt cold beneath my clammy hands. Mr. Nichols, our family lawyer for longer than I'd been alive, cleared his throat, the sound echoing too loudly in the stuffy room. "And to my granddaughter Naomi," he read, his voice a dry rustle of old paper, "I bequeath the entirety of my residual estate." My breath hitched. Gran. She'd always said, "This is for you, Naomi, for your future. Don't let anyone tell you different." My name is Naomi, by the way. And for a fleeting second, a tiny, fragile bird of hope fluttered in my chest. A fresh start. A way out from under my father's suffocating scrutiny. Then Julian, my father, chuckled. It wasn't a warm sound, it was the kind of chuckle that always preceded a pronouncement, usually one designed to put me in my place. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on that cold, expensive table, his eyes so like mine, yet so much colder, fixing on me. That familiar condescending smirk played on his lips. I knew that smirk. It had haunted my childhood, my teenage years, every small achievement he'd managed to belittle. "Well, that's very generous of dear old mother," he said, his voice smooth as silk, yet laced with something sharp. "Of course, Naomi, you understand that a sum of this magnitude requires careful management," I frowned. "I understand, Dad. Gran always said she trusted me." "Oh, darling," he said, the darling like a verbal pat on the head. "Trust is one thing, prudence is another. You're young, you're not exactly known for your financial acumen, are you?" My Uncle Clay, sitting beside him, shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. He just stared at a spot on the table, his jowls quivering slightly. He always did what Julian told him. Always. "So," Julian continued, his smirk widening, "Clay and I have discussed this at length with Mr. Nichols. For your own protection, of course, the inheritance will be placed into a secure trust. Clay will be the primary trustee. He knows best how to handle your money, darling. He has a knack for these things." The air rushed out of my lungs. "A trust? But Gran wanted me to have it." My voice was small, shaky. I hated how weak I sounded. "And you will, in a manner of speaking," Julian said, waving a dismissive hand. "You'll receive a regular allowance, enough for your needs. Clay will ensure the capital grows, provides a steady income. It's the sensible thing to do. You're just not responsible." Each word was a tiny poisoned dart. Not responsible. Me, who'd worked part-time jobs since I was 16 to have any spending money of my own, because his support was always conditional and grudging. Me, who'd managed to get decent grades despite the constant tension in our house. "I don't agree," I said, trying to inject strength into my voice. "I want to manage my own money. Gran wanted me to." Mr. Nichols cleared his throat again. "Naomi, the trust structure is quite common in these situations. Your father and uncle, as trustees, will act in your best interest." "My best interest?" I looked from Julian's smug face to Clay's averted gaze. "Or theirs?" Julian's eyes narrowed. "Now, don't be ungrateful, Naomi. We're doing this for you, to prevent you from squandering what your grandmother worked so hard for." He leaned back, the picture of magnanimous authority. "It's settled. Clay will arrange for your first allowance payment next week." Clay finally looked up, a flicker of something, pity, guilt, in his eyes before it was quickly extinguished. "Yes, Naomi, we'll take good care of it for you." I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw something. But I was 22, just out of university, with a useless arts degree Julian had insisted on, and they held all the cards. My protests were swatted away like annoying flies. The meeting ended with Julian clapping Clay on the back, both of them looking immensely pleased with themselves. Mr. Nichols offered me a weak, sympathetic smile that didn't reach his eyes. The first allowance arrived a week later. A pathetic sum, barely enough to cover the rent on my tiny, bleak studio apartment and a week's worth of instant noodles. I sat on my lumpy mattress, the cheque clutched in my hand, the paper crinkling. The amount was an insult, a clear message of my perceived worthlessness. Through the thin walls I could hear my neighbours arguing. The air in the room was stale, heavy with the smell of damp and defeat. I closed my eyes and all I could see was my father's smirk, that triumphant, knowing smirk. He thought he'd won. He thought I was a silly, incapable girl he could control forever. A cold, hard knot formed in my stomach. It wasn't just anger, it was something deeper, colder, a resolve that settled into my bones. They would pay for this. Every last condescending smirk, every dismissive word, every penny they thought they could control. They would all pay. The next 5 years were a masterclass in humiliation, served cold and often. My allowance, as Julian so generously called it, barely stretched to cover rent on a succession of increasingly depressing basement apartments and a diet that consisted mainly of instant noodles and discount bread. I juggled 2, sometimes 3 dead-end part-time jobs: barista, bookstore clerk, late-night shelf stacker, just to afford textbooks for the community college courses I secretly enrolled in, and to occasionally buy vegetables. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was living like a pauper while my inheritance, my grandmother's legacy, was supposedly growing under the expert management of my father and Uncle Clay. Their lives, in stark contrast, blossomed. My social media feeds, which I morbidly scrolled through in the dead of night, became a gallery of their newfound opulence. Julian, with his arm around his new, much younger wife, Gemma, a woman who'd appeared shortly after the trust was established, beaming from the deck of a yacht in the Mediterranean. Uncle Clay grinning beside a gleaming new sports car, the kind he'd only ever dreamed of. Lavish dinner parties at Julian's renovated house, Gemma dripping in jewels, raising a champagne flute in a toast, her captions full of hashtags like "Pasht, blessed" and "Why living our best life," all I knew with a sickening certainty, funded by trust income. Our phone calls were rare and excruciating. Julian would adopt a tone of strained paternal concern. "Are you managing, Naomi? Eating properly? Clay tells me the investments are doing wonderfully. You should be grateful." Gemma, if she was on the line, would chime in with a saccharine. "We do so worry about you, dear. It must be so challenging." The unspoken "for someone like you" hung heavy in the air. Each word was a fresh stab, a reminder of their betrayal and my powerlessness. The degradation was constant, a slow burn that fueled a rage I kept tightly coiled inside. I learned to smile weakly, to murmur vague assurances, to end the calls as quickly as possible before the bitterness choked me. One evening, after a particularly grueling shift where a customer had screamed at me for 5 minutes because his latte wasn't hot enough, I sat in my cramped room, the smell of stale coffee clinging to my clothes. I was tired, bone-achingly tired, but the anger was a live wire. I wouldn't just get mad, I'd get even. That night I filled out the application for a competitive MBA program, focusing on finance. It was a long shot, my academic record was patchy, my funds non-existent, but the thought of their faces when I finally confronted them was a powerful motivator. Against all odds, weeks later, an acceptance letter arrived. The real turning point, the moment my simmering anger began to sharpen into a focused weapon, came about a year into my secret studies. I'd called Julian about something mundane, a forgotten childhood memento I hoped he might still have. He was dismissive, clearly busy. "Can't talk now, Naomi. Gemma's got a fitting for her new boutique. Big launch party next month." Then just before he hung up, I heard him say to someone in the background, presumably Uncle Clay, his voice carrying clearly, "Don't worry, she'll never be smart enough to figure anything out. Just keep the income flowing for Gemma's new boutique. It's keeping her happy." He didn't even bother to make sure I'd hung up. The casual cruelty of it, the utter contempt in his voice, stole my breath. Gemma's boutique. So it wasn't just holidays and cars. They were siphoning off funds for her vanity projects. My grandmother's money, meant for my future, was being used to stock designer handbags for a woman who probably thought fiduciary duty was a brand of perfume. That night, sleep was impossible. The image of Gemma, preening in her new shop, funded by my stolen legacy, burned behind my eyelids. My resolve, already firm, solidified into something unbreakable, something diamond hard. They thought I was stupid. They thought I was weak. They were about to find out just how wrong they were. The MBA program was a beast. Financial accounting, corporate strategy, investment analysis. The concepts were dense, the hours brutal. I was often the last one to leave the library, fueled by lukewarm coffee from a thermos and a gnawing hunger that the Trust's pittance couldn't quite satisfy. Juggling classes, assignments, and my part-time job at a campus coffee shop to cover living expenses felt like walking a tightrope over a canyon. There were nights I'd stare at a spreadsheet until the numbers blurred, the sheer weight of it all threatening to crush me. Loneliness was a constant companion, a shadow clinging to me as I navigated a world so far removed from the one Julian and Gemma inhabited. It was during a late-night study session hunched over a corporate finance textbook that I met Phoebe. She was just as stressed, just as caffeine-dependent, but she had a quick wit and a surprisingly sunny disposition despite the academic pressure. "You look like you're about to declare war on that textbook," she'd said, offering me half of her sandwich. We became fast friends, study partners, and eventually she became the only person I trusted with fragments of my story. Her outrage on my behalf was a balm, her unwavering belief in me a lifeline. One afternoon in Professor Davies's ethics class, he was lecturing on fiduciary duties, the legal obligation of one party to act in the best interest of another. "A trustee," he'd said, his gaze sweeping the room, "holds a position of immense trust and responsibility. Mismanagement or self-dealing is not just unethical, it's a serious breach." A spark ignited in my mind. It was more than a spark. It was a flare, illuminating a potential path through the darkness of my situation. Armed with this new understanding, I began requesting the annual trust statements. Mr. Nichols' office would send them over, always a few weeks late, always with a curt cover letter. They were professionally printed, full of jargon and deliberately vague. Portfolio growth, management fees, investment service charges. The numbers seemed designed to obfuscate rather than inform. But with my growing financial literacy, I started to see patterns. The management fees paid to Clay were consistently high, suspiciously so. The investment service charges were astronomical for a portfolio that, according to their own bland summaries, was delivering only modest returns. My requests for more detailed breakdowns for specifics on these charges were met with condescending brush-offs from Uncle Clay, usually via email, CCing Mr. Nichols. "Naomi dear, these are standard industry practices, very complex, best leave it to the professionals." Or, "The trust is performing well, no need to concern yourself with the minutiae." Julian, if I dared to bring it up with him, would simply laugh. "Still playing at being a businesswoman, are we? Focus on your studies, darling." Their dismissiveness only fueled my suspicion. There was something they weren't telling me, something hidden beneath the glossy veneer of those statements. Then, one evening, while procrastinating on a particularly difficult derivatives assignment, I started digging, not into the trust directly, I knew they'd have that locked down, but into Gemma. Public business registries were a goldmine. It didn't take long to find it. Gemma's Chic Boutique LLC, registered a few months after the trust was established. And then, the kicker, a record of a significant capital injection into the LLC, listed under private equity placement. The source wasn't named, but the timing, the amount, it lined up too perfectly with a large, vaguely described alternative investment withdrawal on one of the earlier trust statements. My blood ran cold, then hot. This wasn't just them skimming the income, living large on the dividends. They were dipping into the principal. My grandmother's hard-earned money, the core of my inheritance, was being funneled into Gemma's frivolous business venture, a vanity project. The rage that had been a simmering ember now roared into a conflagration. They weren't just careless, they were actively plundering it. Getting my hands on the full original trust deed felt like a covert operation. I called Mr. Nichols' office, affecting a slightly ditzy, overwhelmed student persona. Mr. Nichols, hi, it's Naomi. I'm so sorry to bother you, but for one of my university assignments, a really boring hypothetical case study, I need an example of a trust document. I was wondering if I could possibly get a copy of, mine. There was a pause, then his secretary, a flustered woman named Doris, said she'd have to ask. An hour later, she called back. Mr. Nichols said it's highly irregular, Naomi, but as it's for your education, you can pick up a copy. I could almost hear Julian's voice in the background, probably telling Nichols to humour the silly girl. The document was a brick, pages and pages of dense legalese, clauses and subclauses designed to intimidate and confuse. I spread it out on my small desk, the cheap particle board, groaning under its weight. For weeks, it became my obsession. Between classes, during my lunch break at the coffee shop, late into the night, I pored over every line. My textbooks on trust law and financial regulations became my constant companions. I cross-referenced terms, looked up precedents, highlighted sections until the pages were a riot of yellow and pink. Phoebe would find me asleep at my desk, face pressed against a particularly convoluted paragraph about trustee liabilities. You're going to give yourself an aneurysm, she'd say, gently shaking me awake. Meanwhile, Julian, Clay, and Gemma seemed to be escalating their spending. Perhaps they sensed the 5-year review period for the trust. The vow echoed in the silence of my tiny, bleak apartment. They will all pay. But saying it was one thing, surviving long enough to make it happen was another. The next 5 years were a masterclass in humiliation, served cold and often. My allowance, as Julian so generously termed it, was a cruel joke. It barely covered the rent on a succession of increasingly depressing basement flats, each with its own unique collection of peeling paint and questionable stains. Instant noodles became a food group. I learned to tell the difference between a dozen brands, rating them by how little they tasted like cardboard. Discount bread, often a day or two from expiring, was a treat. To supplement the pittance, I worked and worked. Barista shifts starting at dawn, smelling perpetually of burnt coffee. Retail jobs where I folded sweaters for hours, smiling vacantly at rude customers. Late-night shelf stacking in supermarkets, the fluorescent lights buzzing over my head like angry insects. Each job was a dead end, each paycheck a reminder of how far I had to climb. My hands were perpetually rough, my back ached, and sleep was a luxury I couldn't always afford. Meanwhile, my phone, a cheap second-hand model, became a window into their glittering world. Julian, Clay, and a new woman, Gemma, Julian's much younger, glossier wife, who'd conveniently appeared after the trust was set up, seemed to live exclusively on Instagram. There was Julian, grinning from the deck of a yacht in the Mediterranean, arm around Gemma, who was draped in something floaty and expensive. Another tough day at the office. Shakor blessed Tan making memories, the caption read. Uncle Clay, looking like a stuffed sausage in a linen suit, posed beside a cherry-red sports car I knew for a fact he couldn't have afforded on his old salary. Mid-life crisis? Nah, just enjoying the fruits of good investments. Hard work pays off. Gemma especially loved to flaunt. Endless posts of designer shopping bags, Michelin-starred meals and lavish parties at Julian's newly renovated house. A house Gran had always said was too ostentatious. Her captions were often dripping with faux humility. Just a little something to brighten the day. retail therapy, nah, so grateful. Each post was a fresh twist of the knife. My grandmother's money, my future. Their rare phone calls were an exercise in biting my tongue. "Naomi, darling, are you managing all right?" Julian would ask, his voice oozing a concern so fake it was almost transparent. "Clay tells me the trust is performing exceptionally well. You should be very pleased." "Oh, yes, Dad, thrilled," I'd reply, staring at a leaking pipe in my current hovel. Gemma would sometimes get on the line, her voice like honey mixed with arsenic. "We do so worry about you, sweetie. It must be so challenging for you, all on your own. Are you eating properly?" "Instant noodles are surprisingly versatile, Gemma," I once said, unable to stop myself. There was a slight pause. "Oh, well, as long as you're happy, dear." Happy. The word felt like a foreign language. The constant degradation, the casual cruelty, the sheer obliviousness. It all swirled inside me, a toxic brew. But it didn't break me. It did the opposite. It forged something hard and sharp within my core. One particularly bleak evening after a customer had thrown a lukewarm coffee at me because it wasn't artisanal enough, I sat on my lumpy mattress, the smell of cheap coffee and righteous indignation clinging to me. I looked at my reflection in the cracked mirror. Tired eyes, pale skin, clothes that had seen better days. This wasn't me. This wasn't who I was going to be. I wouldn't just get mad. I would get even. That night, huddled under a thin blanket for warmth, I used the flickering Wi-Fi from the cafe downstairs to secretly research MBA programs, finance specifically. If money was their weapon, it would become mine too. It was a wild, audacious plan. My grades from my useless arts degree were average, my funds non-existent. But the image of their shocked faces, the thought of wiping those condescending smirks away, was a powerful fuel. Weeks later, an acceptance letter from a decent, if not top-tier university arrived. I'd have to take out student loans, work even harder, but it was a start, a path. The final, irrevocable hardening of my resolve came about a year into this new, secret life. I'd called Julian, a rare occurrence, to ask about some old family photos Gran had kept, hoping they hadn't been thrown out in his relentless pursuit of modern minimalism. He was, as usual, dismissive. "Can't talk now, Naomi. Gemma's in a flap about the launch of her new boutique. Very high-end. Big investors." He sounded bored, like I was an annoying interruption. Then, just as I was about to hang up, I heard him say, clearly to someone else in the room. Uncle Clay, I presumed, by the subsequent mumble of agreement. "Don't worry, she'll never be smart enough to figure anything out. Just keep the income flowing for Gemma's new boutique. It's keeping her happy and, happy wife, happy life." He didn't even bother to check if I'd disconnected. The casual, brutal dismissal, the confirmation that my inheritance was actively funding Gemma's vanity project. Smart enough. He thought I was an idiot. The line went dead, but his words hung in the air, cold and sharp. My breath caught in my throat. A chill snaked down my spine, but it wasn't fear. It was ice, pure, unadulterated, vengeful ice. "Oh, I'm smart enough, Dad," I whispered to the empty room. "You just wait and see." The MBA program was a relentless beast. Financial accounting felt like learning a new language, one spoken entirely in spreadsheets and balance sheets. Corporate strategy involved dissecting case studies of failed companies, a grim but educational pastime. Investment analysis made my head spin with talk of derivatives, alphas, and betas. I was often the last person to stumble out of the university library, eyes gritty from staring at a screen, my backpack heavy with textbooks that cost more than my monthly food budget. My part-time job at the campus coffee shop, though a step up from previous gigs, meant early mornings and the constant smell of espresso clinging to my clothes. There were nights I'd fall asleep face down on my notes, a half-eaten bowl of instant ramen cooling beside me, the sheer exhaustion of physical weight. "You look like you're about to wage a one-woman war against that discounted cash flow model," a voice said one evening. I jumped, nearly knocking over my lukewarm coffee. A young woman with bright pink streaks in her dark hair and an amused smile stood by my table in the near-empty library. "Sorry, didn't mean to scare you. I'm Phoebe. We have advanced corporate finance together." "Naomi," I managed, rubbing my eyes. "And yes, I think the DCF model is winning." Phoebe pulled up a chair. "Tell me about it. I swear Professor Armitage enjoys watching us suffer." She offered me a piece of her chocolate bar. "Survival rations." That was how I met Phoebe. She was sharp, funny, and refreshingly down to earth. We started studying together, quizzing each other, complaining about impossible assignments. Slowly, cautiously, I started to let my guard down. I didn't tell her everything, not about the trust or the full extent of my family's betrayal, but I told her enough for her to understand the pressure I was under. Her unwavering support, her "You got this, Naomi," before every exam, became a small island of sanity in my otherwise turbulent life. One afternoon, in Professor Davies' ethics seminar, he was lecturing on fiduciary duties. He was a stern, old-school academic with a piercing gaze. "A trustee," he declared, pacing in front of the class, "is entrusted with the assets of another. Their duty is singular, to act solely in the best interest of the beneficiary. Any deviation, any self-dealing or gross negligence is not merely an error in judgment. It is a profound breach of trust, with significant legal consequences." His words hit me with the force of a physical blow. Solely in the best interest of the beneficiary. My father's voice echoed in my mind. "Just keep the income flowing for Gemma's new boutique." That lecture was the catalyst. Armed with a new terrifying vocabulary, fiduciary duty, breach of trust, mismanagement, I started to act. I drafted a polite, formal letter to Mr. Nichols' office, requesting copies of the annual trust statements. "For my personal financial planning," I wrote, hoping it sounded plausible. A few weeks later, a thick envelope arrived. The statements were professionally printed, glossy, and utterly uninformative. Columns of figures under headings like portfolio allocation, realized gains, and administrative expenses. The numbers were large, but the explanations were non-existent. I spread them out on my tiny desk, Phoebe looking over my shoulder. "What are discretionary management fees?" I asked her, pointing to a hefty sum deducted quarterly. Phoebe frowned. "Usually what the trustee charges for managing the investments. But that looks high, especially if Clay isn't a professional fund manager." He wasn't. He was a failed real estate agent before Julian had apparently decided he had a knack for money. I emailed Uncle Clay, CCing Mr. Nichols. "Dear Uncle Clay, I was reviewing the latest trust statement and had a few questions about the management fees and some of the investment service charges. Could you perhaps provide a more detailed breakdown?" His reply came a day later, dripping with condescension. "Naomi, my dear, these are rather complex financial matters. Standard industry practice. The trust is performing very well under my stewardship, and Mr. Nichols oversees everything. There's really no need for you to worry your pretty little head about the details. Just enjoy the benefits." Julian, when I tried to ask him during a brief, strained phone call, just laughed. "Still playing at being a financial whiz, are we? Honestly, Naomi, some people just aren't cut out for numbers. Leave it to the experts." Their dismissiveness was like waving a red flag at a bull. If it was also standard, so above board, why the secrecy? Why the patronizing tone? One evening, fueled by cheap coffee and righteous anger, I decided to do some digging beyond the opaque trust statements. If they were funneling money, where would it go? Gemma's boutique. It was a long shot, but I typed Gemma Butler business registration into a search engine. It didn't take long. public records for new businesses were surprisingly accessible. Gemma's Chic Boutique LLC, registered just a few months after Gran died. My heart began to pound. I kept digging, sifting through online databases, business registries, anything I could find. And then I saw it. A filing related to the boutique's initial capitalization. Under sources of funding, alongside a small business loan, was a very large, very specific sum listed as private equity placement. I scrambled back to the trust statements from that first year. My eyes scanned the investment activities section, and there it was, a withdrawal of an almost identical amount, vaguely categorized as strategic allocation, private venture capital. My breath hitched. I stared at the screen, the numbers blurring. It wasn't just income they were spending. It wasn't just lavish holidays and new cars from the profits. They had taken a huge chunk of the principal, my grandmother's actual savings, the core of my inheritance, and invested it in Gemma's ridiculous, overpriced shop. A wave of nausea washed over me, followed by a surge of icy rage so intense it made me tremble. They weren't just living off the interest, they were actively draining the well. This wasn't mismanagement, this was theft. The discovery about Gemma's boutique lit a fire under me. I needed more than just vague statements and public records. I needed the source document, the blueprint of their betrayal, the original trust deed. Getting it from Mr. Nichols, however, required a performance. I called his office, pitching my voice a little higher, injecting a note of hapless student confusion. "Doris, hi, it's Naomi. So sorry to bother you again." Doris was Mr. Nichols' long-suffering, slightly scatterbrained secretary. "You know that university assignment I mentioned? The one on trust law? Well, my professor, he's a real stickler for details, and he said I need to analyse an actual trust instrument, not just a summary. I was wondering, and this is probably a huge ask, if I could possibly get a copy of, the full deed for Gran's trust. Just for the hypothetical case study, of course. I promised to be super careful with it." There was a long pause filled with the rustling of papers on Doris's end. "Oh dear, that's highly unusual, Naomi. Mr. Nichols keeps those documents very secure." I know, I said, trying to sound apologetic and a little desperate. "It's just Professor Armitage is really strict, and I'm worried about my grade. It would be such a massive help." "Let me speak to Mr. Nichols," she said finally. "I can't promise anything." An hour later, my phone rang. It was Doris. "Well, Naomi," she began, her voice still hesitant, "Mr. Nichols said, he said it's against his better judgment, but seeing as it's for your education, and you are the beneficiary, he's authorized me to provide you with a copy. You can pick it up this afternoon. But he stressed it's for academic purposes only." I could almost hear Julian's voice in the background of that decision, dismissing me. "Let the girl play with her papers. What harm can she do?" "Oh, Doris, thank you. Thank Mr. Nichols for me. You're lifesavers," I gushed, laying it on thick. The document they handed me was a tome. Seriously, it was nearly an inch thick, bound in a stiff blue cover, filled with page after page of dense, impenetrable legalese. Clauses, sub-clauses, codicils, riders. It was designed to make your eyes glaze over, to make you give up and just trust the experts. I carried it back to my tiny apartment like it was a sacred text and a ticking bomb, all in one. For weeks that trust deed became my world. I spread it out on my small wobbly desk, the cheap particle board groaning under its weight. My MBA textbooks on contract law, trust administration, and financial regulations were piled beside it. Highlighters in yellow, pink, and orange lay scattered like fallen soldiers. I read every word, every sentence, sometimes 10 times over. I looked up legal terms I didn't understand, cross-referencing them with online legal dictionaries and my textbooks. Phoebe would often find me asleep at my desk, my cheek pressed against a particularly convoluted paragraph about trustee powers and limitations. "Naomi, you're going to give yourself an aneurysm," she'd say, gently shaking me awake and pushing a cup of coffee into my hand. "What are you even looking for?" "A loophole," I'd mumble, still half asleep. "A way out or a way in." Meanwhile, Julian, Clay and Gemma seemed to be accelerating their spending spree. It was as if they sensed some invisible clock ticking down. Gemma's Instagram was a relentless barrage of conspicuous consumption. A new diamond bracelet, just a little Tuesday treat, just sparkle. A weekend trip to Paris, catching the last of the autumn leaves, Chacun, City of Love. And then the pièce de résistance, a post featuring her and Julian, clinking champagne glasses with the Eiffel Tower glittering behind them. The caption read, "Counting down the days to our amazing anniversary trip to Monaco. Julian is spoiling me rotten with a bonus from the Trust's excellent performance this year. So grateful for his financial wizardry. Monaco bound, our anniversary goals, our trust fund baby, almost." The wink emoji felt like a personal insult. My trust, my grandmother's money. Their excellent performance was my dwindling inheritance. The 5-year mark for the trust was approaching, a point at which, according to the initial vague explanations, there might be some sort of review. Perhaps they were trying to extract maximum value before then, thinking I was still the naive girl they'd dismissed 5 years prior. Late one night, fueled by stale coffee and a growing sense of desperation, I was on page 47, Section D, Subclause T. My eyes were burning, the words starting to swim. Most of it was standard boilerplate about trustee responsibilities, distribution schedules, and the like. I'd almost skimmed past it, thinking it was just another impenetrable block of text. But something made me pause. A phrase, "Conditions under which the primary beneficiary may petition for a change in directorial control of the trust assets." My heart gave a sudden hard thump against my ribs. I read it again, slowly. Such conditions to include, but not be limited to, demonstrable gross negligence or misconduct by the appointed trustees, or the attainment by the primary beneficiary of recognised professional financial certifications and qualifications deemed sufficient by an independent arbiter to demonstrate capacity for prudent financial management. My breath caught in my throat. I reread the last part. Attainment of recognised professional financial certifications. My MBA, the finance specialisation, the extra courses I was considering in portfolio management. My hand, holding the highlighter, was trembling. I carefully drew a line under the entire subclause. Could this be it? A tiny, almost invisible escape hatch, buried deep within the legal jargon, a clause they had clearly overlooked or dismissed as irrelevant for someone like me. A slow smile spread across my face. It wasn't over, it was just beginning. That subclause became my North Star. Attainment of recognised professional financial certifications. It wasn't just a vague aspiration anymore, it was a specific, actionable target. My MBA was a solid foundation, but the wording recognised professional financial certifications hinted at something more, something industry standard that would be undeniable. I threw myself into researching the most respected certifications in finance, the CFA, the CFP, anything that screamed competent and qualified. It meant an extra layer of intense study on top of my already demanding MBA finals. My tiny apartment became a fortress of textbooks and practice exams. Sleep became a rumour. Phoebe, bless her, turned into my personal drill sergeant and cheerleader. "Okay, question truck 512, she'd say, peering at a flashcard. "Explain the efficient market hypothesis and its 3 forms." "Weak, semi-strong, and strong," I'd recite, pacing my tiny room. Weak form says past prices don't predict future prices. She'd grill me for hours, then make me tea and tell me I was a rock star. You're going to ace these, Naomi, and then you're going to... Well, whatever it is you're planning, it's going to be epic. She still didn't know the full details, but she knew enough to sense the monumental stakes. I passed my MBA exams with distinction, a small, sweet victory that tasted like freedom. Then, one by one, I tackled the certifications. Each exam was a multi-hour marathon of complex calculations and ethical dilemmas. Each pass certificate that arrived in the mail was another stone in the foundation of my plan. With my MBA diploma and the first couple of certifications in hand, I decided to subtly probe Mr. Nichols. I scheduled a brief phone call, ostensibly to ask about the upcoming 5-year review of the trust. Just wondering if there's anything I need to prepare, Mr. Nichols? Any paperwork? Oh, no, Naomi, my dear, he said, his voice avuncular and dismissive. Just a formality, really. Clay and your father handle all the substantive matters. We'll send you a summary report as usual. Then I casually dropped it in. I was rereading the trust deed for that university project I mentioned, and I came across a rather interesting clause about the beneficiary potentially taking a more active role if they had certain financial qualifications. Section D, I think it was. Is that something that ever happens? There was a distinct pause on the other end of the line. Ah, yes, Mr. Nichols said, a little too quickly. Highly theoretical, that clause, Naomi. Very, very rarely invoked. Not really applicable to your situation, I wouldn't think. The current arrangement is serving you very well. His dismissive tone, the way he brushed it off as highly theoretical, told me everything I needed to know. He either genuinely hadn't considered its power, or, more likely, Julian had instructed him years ago to downplay it, to ensure I never saw it as a viable option. My suspicion that he was more than just a negligent old lawyer, that he was firmly in Julian's pocket, solidified. He wasn't just incompetent, he was complicit. The final piece of the puzzle, the one that lit a fire under me to accelerate everything, arrived not through my own digging, but through sheer dumb luck, or perhaps a tiny act of rebellion from a stressed-out secretary. An email landed in my inbox. The subject line was FWD Urgent Trust Restructuring Options. It was from Doris, Mr. Nichols' secretary. The body of the email simply said, Julian, please see attached memo from Mr. Nichols R.E., our discussion. Let me know your thoughts. Clay. Attached was a confidential memo from Mr. Nichols to Julian and Clay. My blood ran cold as I read it. Further to our conversation regarding the upcoming 5-year review and the potential for unforeseen claims or challenges from the beneficiary, the memo began, I have outlined several options for restructuring the trust. These amendments would serve to further protect the trust assets and solidify current directorial control, limiting the beneficiary's capacity to interfere with or alter the established management structure. They were trying to lock me out, permanently. They must have gotten wind of my MBA, or perhaps my polite inquiries had spooked them. They thought I was still the clueless girl, easily fobbed off. They were moving to change the rules of the game before I even had a chance to play. The memo detailed strategies to make it virtually impossible for me to ever gain control, to tie up the assets in such a way that only they could access them, citing long-term capital preservation and protection against immature financial decisions by the beneficiary. My hands were shaking as I printed it out. The arrogance, the deceit! Phoebe found me staring at it, my face pale. What is it? She asked, her voice laced with concern. I just handed her the memo. She read it, her eyes widening with each paragraph. Oh, Naomi, she breathed, looking up at me. These guys they're ruthless. Yes, I said, my voice tight. And they think I'm stupid. The clock was ticking, faster than I'd ever imagined. My final certification exam was in 3 weeks. The trust review meeting would likely be scheduled shortly after. I had to be ready. The weapon was nearly forged, but my enemies were already trying to dismantle the battlefield. The misdirected email from Doris detailing their plans to lock me out of the trust permanently was the final jolt I needed. The game had changed. It wasn't just about reclaiming what was mine anymore. It was a race against time. My final certification exam, the capstone to my carefully constructed arsenal of qualifications, suddenly felt less like an academic hurdle and more like the key to my survival. Those last 3 weeks were a blur of frantic, focused energy. I lived in the library, at my tiny desk, surrounded by stacks of notes and empty coffee cups. Phoebe was my lifeline, quizzing me relentlessly, pushing me when I wanted to collapse from exhaustion, and celebrating every practice exam I aced. "You're not just doing this for you anymore, Naomi," she said one late night, her voice serious. "You're doing this for everyone who's ever been underestimated." The day I walked out of that final exam, my head was pounding, but my heart was light. I knew I'd nailed it. The official confirmation arrived a week later. "We are pleased to inform you that you have successfully passed." I read the words over and over, a triumphant grin spreading across my face. The weapon was forged. Almost as if on cue, the official notification for the annual trust review meeting landed on my doormat the next day. A stiff, cream-coloured envelope from Mr. Nichols' law firm. The meeting was scheduled for 2 weeks hence. The timing was so perfect. It felt almost scripted by a higher power with a wicked sense of irony. Those 2 weeks were spent in meticulous preparation. This wasn't just about invoking a clause in a dusty old document. It was about dismantling their empire of lies, brick by brick. I compiled everything. Copies of the trust deed with the crucial sub-clause highlighted, my MBA diploma, all my financial certification certificates, the vague and misleading annual trust statements they'd sent me over the years, and, most damningly, printouts of Gemma's social media posts showcasing their extravagant lifestyle, juxtaposed with bank statements showing my meagre allowance. I even created a concise PowerPoint presentation, a habit picked up during my MBA, summarising the trust's actual performance, or lack thereof once their exorbitant fees and Gemma's boutique investment were factored in, versus its potential had it been managed competently and ethically. I practiced my delivery in front of the cracked mirror in my apartment over and over. I needed to be calm, factual, and unshakable. No tears, no hysterics, no emotional outbursts that they could dismiss as typical female overreaction. Just cold, hard facts delivered with the precision of a surgeon. "Good afternoon, gentlemen," I'd say to my reflection. "And Gemma, thank you for convening this meeting. I have a few points I'd like to raise regarding the administration of the trust." Phoebe helped me pick out an outfit. We stood in front of my tiny, overflowing closet, which mostly consisted of worn-out student clothes and barista uniforms. "Nothing in here screams I'm about to financially disembowel my duplicitous family," Phoebe declared, hands on her hips. We ended up at a consignment store where we found a perfectly tailored dark grey pantsuit and a crisp white blouse. It was simple, professional, and made me feel about 10 feet tall. "That's the one," Phoebe said, nodding approvingly. "That says, 'I am no longer the girl you knew. I am your worst nightmare, and I have spreadsheets.'" The night before the meeting, I stood in front of that mirror again, wearing the suit. The transformation was startling. The tired, struggling student who had lived on instant noodles and righteous anger was still there, under the surface, but the woman looking back at me was different. Her eyes were clear, her jaw set. There was a quiet confidence in her stance, a steely resolve that hadn't been there before. This was Naomi Burke, MBA, certified financial professional, ready for war. My phone buzzed. It was Julian. My heart gave a nervous flutter, then settled. "Naomi, darling," his voice oozed that familiar false paternal warmth. "Just calling about tomorrow. Don't you worry your pretty little head about a thing. Just a formality, as always. Clay and I have it all handled. Wear something nice, but there's no need for you to get involved in the boring details. We'll be in and out." I took a slow, steadying breath. "Oh, I wouldn't miss it for the world, Dad," I replied, my voice cool and even. "And actually, I'll be very interested in the details this year." There was a slight pause on his end, a fractional hesitation before he chuckled, a little too loudly. "All right then, darling, see you tomorrow." He hung up. That tiny pause, that flicker of surprise in his usually unflappable demeanour, was more satisfying than I could have imagined. He had no idea what was coming. The boardroom at Mr. Nichols' law firm was exactly as I remembered. Mahogany table, leather chairs, an air of quiet, expensive intimidation. Julian was already there, leaning back in his chair, exuding an aura of smug self-importance. Uncle Clay sat beside him, looking slightly rumpled and nervous, fiddling with a pen. Mr. Nichols was at the head of the table, shuffling papers with a practised air of gravitas. And then a surprise. Gemma. She was perched elegantly on a chair slightly behind Julian, dressed in a vibrant silk dress, a large designer handbag at her feet. No doubt here for moral support, and probably to start planning how to spend the next bonus from the trust. They all looked up as I walked in. Julian offered a tight, patronising smile. "Naomi, darling. Punctual. Good." Gemma gave me a little wave, her eyes flicking over my new suit with a flicker of something I couldn't quite decipher. Surprise? Disdain? I took the empty seat opposite them, placing my slim briefcase on the table. "Good morning, Julian. Uncle Clay, Mr. Nichols, Gemma." Mr. Nichols cleared his throat. "Well, shall we begin? As you know, Naomi, this is the annual review of the trust established by your grandmother. Julian and Clay, as trustees, will provide a brief overview of its performance over the past year." Julian nodded, taking centre stage. "Indeed. And I'm pleased to report, Naomi, that despite some market volatility, Clay has managed to secure solid returns. Very solid. The capital is secure and the income stream remains robust." He gestured vaguely towards Clay. Clay mumbled, "Yes, quite robust. We've been very prudent." He avoided my gaze. They launched into their usual vague summary, filled with financial jargon they clearly expected me to not understand, painting a picture of diligent stewardship. I let them talk for a few minutes, watching their confident expressions, Gemma's occasional encouraging nod to Julian. Then when Julian paused for breath, I calmly interjected. "Excuse me." All eyes turned to me. Julian frowned slightly. "Yes, Naomi?" "Before we go any further," I said, my voice steady, "I have a few things I'd like to present." I opened my briefcase and took out a slim folder. Firstly, for the record, I'd like to note that I recently completed my Master of Business Administration with a specialisation in finance. I slid a copy of my diploma across the table, and subsequently I have attained the following professional financial certifications. I laid out the certificates one by one, CFA, CFP. Copies for your records, of course. A stunned silence fell over the room. Julian stared at the documents, his smirk faltering. Clay's jaw literally dropped. Gemma's perfectly plucked eyebrows shot up. Mr. Nichols blinked rapidly, looking from the certificates to me. "Furthermore," I continued, my voice gaining strength, "I've taken the liberty of preparing my own analysis of the Trust's performance over the past 5 years. I connected my laptop to the projector they had at one end of the room. I'd asked Doris to ensure it was available for my notes. My PowerPoint presentation flashed onto the screen. The first slide was a simple comparison. The meagre allowance I'd received versus screenshots of Gemma's Instagram posts detailing their lavish holidays, new cars and expensive purchases, all time-stamped. Gemma gasped, her face flushing. Julian's turned a dangerous shade of red. "This," I said, clicking to the next slide, "is a breakdown of the management fees and investment service charges you've been levying. They appear to be significantly above industry standards for a trust of this size and risk profile, particularly given that neither of you possesses formal investment management qualifications." Another click. "And this is regarding the private equity placement of a substantial portion of the trust principal into Gemma's Chic Boutique, LLC, an unproven, high-risk retail venture with no discernible connection to prudent fiduciary investment strategy." I showed the public registration documents and the corresponding trust withdrawal. Clay looked like he was about to be physically ill. "Therefore," I announced, my voice ringing with newfound authority, "pursuant to Section D, Subclause 5 of the Trust Deed, a copy of which I have here, which states that the primary beneficiary may petition for a change in directorial control upon attainment of recognized professional financial certifications demonstrating capacity for prudent financial management, I am hereby formally invoking my right to assume full directorial control of the trust, effective immediately." Julian finally found his voice sputtering. "Now, see here, Naomi, this is outrageous. You can't just—" "Actually, Father," I cut him off coolly, "I can. The language is quite clear." I pushed a highlighted copy of the trust deed towards Mr. Nichols, whose face had gone pale. "Perhaps you should re-familiarize yourself with the terms your firm drafted." Then I delivered the final blow. "And furthermore, I'd like to draw your attention to Section E of the same deed concerning gross fiduciary misconduct, a section you all clearly overlooked. It stipulates that in cases of demonstrable mismanagement, self-dealing or fraudulent activity, not only can the trustees be removed, but there is also provision for the clawback of misappropriated funds from the personal assets of said trustees. It also opens the door for legal proceedings to recover damages to the trust." The colour completely drained from Julian's face. Clay made a choking sound. Gemma looked like she'd seen a ghost. Mr. Nichols was shuffling his papers, his hands trembling, suddenly looking terrified. The silence in the room was absolute, thick with their shock and dawning horror. Julian started to bluster again. This is preposterous. I won't allow—" "It's already in motion," I said calmly. "My lawyers, whom I have already consulted and who are on standby, will be in touch with Mr. Nichols' office later today to facilitate the transition of control and to discuss the immediate commencement of a full forensic audit of all trust expenditures over the past 5 years. I stood up, gathering my papers, my composure absolute. The trust and my grandmother's legacy are finally in capable hands. Mine. I turned and walked out of the boardroom, leaving them in a tableau of stunned, horrified silence. The war wasn't just won. It was a rout. The silence I left behind in that boardroom was, I imagined, quickly replaced by panicked shouting and bitter accusations. My lawyers, a sharp, no-nonsense team Phoebe had recommended from her father's firm, moved with swift precision. The clause in the trust deed was ironclad. Mr. Nichols, after a brief, blustering attempt to stall, had no choice but to concede. The transition of control was surprisingly quick. The real fireworks began with the forensic audit. My legal team, armed with my preliminary research and full access to the trust's financials, unearthed a depth of mismanagement and self-dealing that even I hadn't fully anticipated. Gemma's boutique, it turned out, wasn't just a vanity project. It was a financial black hole, hemorrhaging money that Julian and Clay had kept reinvesting from the trust to keep it afloat, and Gemma happy. There were lavish business expenses that were clearly personal holidays, undocumented loans to Clay that were never repaid, and consultancy fees paid to shell companies Julian had set up. The clawback provisions were invoked. Julian and Clay were forced into a series of humiliating liquidations. The shiny sports car Uncle Clay was so proud of, Gone. Julian's collection of expensive watches, sold. Gemma's boutique stripped of its designer stock, most of which was on consignment anyway, it turned out, was shuttered, its chic facade now papered over with 4 lease signs. The equity in their homes was next on the chopping block to cover the shortfall. Their carefully constructed image of wealth and success crumbled like a sandcastle in a tsunami. Their names, once whispered with envy in their social circles, were now muttered with scorn. Gemma, true to form, didn't stick around for the downturn. Once the flow of easy money dried up, so did her affection for Julian. I heard through the grapevine, Phoebe had an uncanny ability to pick up such news, that she'd packed her designer bags and decamped, leaving Julian to face the music alone. Their anniversary trip to Monaco never happened. Julian and Clay's relationship, once a united front of condescension towards me, imploded. They turned on each other, each blaming the other for the mess, for their greed, for getting caught. Their bitter recriminations were apparently epic, further fueling the gossip mills. One evening my phone rang. It was Julian. His voice, stripped of its usual arrogance, was thin and reedy. "Naomi, darling." I said nothing. I just wanted to say, I understand you're upset, but this is destroying us. Your uncle, he's a broken man. Surely you can see there must be some room for understanding, for family. The audacity of it, after everything. I listened to his pathetic, manipulative plea, the silence stretching between us. Then, without a word, I ended the call. Some ties once severed could never be mended, nor did I want them to be. The revenge was sweet, undeniably. Seeing them brought low, stripped of their ill-gotten gains and their social standing, was a deeply satisfying vindication for 5 years of struggle and humiliation. But as the dust settled, the sweetness began to mingle with something else. A quiet finality. The family I had, however dysfunctional, was truly gone. It wasn't regret I felt, not exactly. It was more an acknowledgement of the scars, the price of justice. With the trust firmly under my control and a significant portion of the plundered funds recovered, I set about managing it properly, ethically. The first thing I did was establish a foundation in my grandmother's name, its mission to provide scholarships and grants for young women from disadvantaged backgrounds to pursue education in business and finance. Gran had always believed in the power of knowledge, and this felt like the truest way to honour her legacy. I bought a small, comfortable house in a quiet neighbourhood. Nothing extravagant, but it was mine, bought with money that was truly, unequivocally mine. No more basement apartments, no more instant noodles, unless I actually craved them, which, surprisingly, I sometimes did, a weird memento of my past. Phoebe helped me decorate, her taste far more vibrant than mine, filling the space with colour and life. Standing on my new balcony, looking out at the small garden I was planning, a sense of peace settled over me. The fight was over. I wasn't defined by their betrayal anymore, or even by the victory. I was defined by what I chose to build next. The satisfaction of justice served remained, a warm ember in my chest, a testament to the strength I'd found within myself, a strength Gran had always known I possessed. And Julian's smirk, that condescending, dismissive smirk that had haunted me for years, it was gone, vanished from his face, probably forever. That, I thought, sipping my coffee as the morning sun warmed my face, was the best inheritance of all.